The bill came to $1,240, and I was the one everyone expected to reach for it. That was the joke in our family, if you could call it a joke. Dad always gets the bill. 26 people, 3 bottles of the good Burgundy, a cake the size of a car tire, and me sitting at the end of the table in my good gray sport coat, the one I only wear to church and to things like this. The waiter set the little leather folder down in front of me the way he'd set it down in front of me a dozen times before, at a dozen other dinners, because that's where it always landed. Nobody had to tell him. He just knew, the way you know which chair in a room belongs to which person. I looked at that folder for a second longer than I needed to. 20 minutes earlier, my daughter had stood up in front of everyone at that table, her husband's family. A food critic with a notebook, people from the bank, people I'd never met and would probably never see again, and told a woman named Simone Reyes that I wasn't family. Said it light. Said it like it was nothing. Oh, him? He's an old friend of ours. Used to run a diner, if you can believe it. Isn't that charming? 26 people laughed, not cruelly, just easily, the way people laugh when they think nothing is at stake. I didn't laugh. I didn't correct her either. I sat there and I let it land. Because I have found in 74 years that the moment you argue with someone about whether you matter to them, you have already lost the argument, whatever they say next. So when the folder came to my end of the table, I didn't reach for it. I looked up at the waiter, a young man with tired eyes who had no idea he was standing in the middle of something, and I said 2 words. Wrong table. He blinked. Somebody down the table laughed again, thinking it was a bit, thinking old Hal was being modest, waiting for me to wave him off and pull out the card like always. My daughter's smile started to go thin at the edges. She knew me well enough to know I don't joke with my face that still. Sir? The waiter said. Wrong table, I said again, and I folded my napkin, and I stood up. I'm not family. You heard the woman, and I want you to understand I wasn't bluffing, and I wasn't performing. I had a card in my pocket that none of those 26 people knew existed. One that had been sitting quietly for 8 years, gathering the kind of weight that only time can give a thing. I didn't play it that night. That's not how I do things, but I want you to know, from the very first minute of this story, that the version of me who stood up and walked out of that restaurant without paying a single dollar of that bill was not a broken man having a moment. He was a man who had finally decided to stop paying for a seat he wasn't allowed to have. To understand why I did it and what happened after, you have to go back, further back than that dinner. Back to a woman named Margaret and a diner with 4 stools and a busted milkshake machine and a little girl who used to sit on a flour sack in the kitchen doing her homework while her mother taught her how to make a pie crust that didn't need a recipe card anymore because it lived in her hands. I opened my first diner in 1974. I was 22 years old and I had $400, a used grill, and a wife who believed in me more than I believed in myself. We called it Doyle's Corner. Because it sat on a corner, and because we weren't clever people, we were tired people who worked 16-hour days and were grateful for it. Margaret ran the front. I ran the grill. We built that one diner into 3 over the next 30 years, out on the highway routes where truckers and families and lonesome men on their way somewhere else all needed a plate of something warm and a place to sit for a while. Our daughter Vanessa grew up in a booth in the back corner of the first Doyle's Corner, the one with the wobbly table leg I never got around to fixing. She did her multiplication tables on the paper placemats. She learned to read off the specials board. And when she was 7 years old, her mother started letting her stand on a step stool at the counter and watch her roll dough, and Margaret would say the same thing every single time, like a blessing. The secret's not the recipe, baby. The secret's patience. Anybody can follow a recipe. Not everybody can wait for the dough to tell you it's ready. Margaret kept those recipes in a little tin box. Powder blue, chipped at both corners, dented on one side from the time it fell off the counter during a 4th of July rush in 1986. index cards inside, most of them in her handwriting, a few in her mother's before her. That tin sat on the shelf above the grill in every Doyle's Corner we ever opened. When Margaret passed 12 years ago cancer, quick and cruel the way it sometimes is, that tin came home with me, and it has sat on my kitchen counter every day since. Because some things you don't put away in a drawer. You keep them where you can see them. There was a stretch in the late 80s when we nearly lost all 3 diners at once, a recession that hit the highway trade hard. 14 months where Margaret and I didn't take a paycheck at all. I remember standing in the walk-in cooler one night doing inventory by flashlight so Vanessa, 6 years old then, wouldn't see the worry on my face. Margaret found me there, handed me the tin open to a card for a soup made from nothing but bones and whatever vegetables had gone soft, and said, "We've fed people through worse than this. We'll feed ourselves through it too." We did. That tin got us through more than pie crusts over the years. Vanessa didn't want the diner life. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't a story about a daughter who scorned her father's honest work. She loved that diner. She loved her mother's kitchen. What she wanted, and what I understood even when it stung a little, was something bigger than 4 stools and a highway view. She wanted to build something with white tablecloths and wine pairings and her name on the door in gold letters. She wanted people who had never eaten a blue plate special in their lives to write about her food in magazines. And I thought good. Good for her. A parent who loves a child properly wants that child to reach past where the parent stood. The trouble is, reaching past where your parent stood sometimes means deciding your parent is something you have to explain away to get there. She went to culinary school on scholarships and loans and 2 years of catering shifts that left her hands raw. She married Bradley Marsh at 28, a good-looking young man from a family with old money and older opinions about who belonged at their table. I want to be fair to him here, because he wasn't always the man I'd end up sitting across from in that conference room. In the first 2 years of the marriage, Bradley used to call me Sunday mornings just to talk football. No reason, no agenda. And the summer Vanessa was opening Cerise, he drove out 3 separate weekends to help me reshingle a roof I kept putting off, working alongside me without once acting like it was beneath him. Something changed in him slowly. The way a man's spine bends a little more every time he watches his mother's approval get handed out like a reward for the right kind of company. By that anniversary dinner, the Bradley standing there had drifted a long way from the one who used to climb up on my roof in June. His mother, Diane, ran in circles where nobody's father had ever flipped an egg for a living, and I watched my daughter start, slowly, editing her own history to fit the room she wanted to sit in. When she was 36, she told me she wanted to open her own restaurant. High-end. Downtown, she had a business plan, a location, a head chef's resume that made me proud just reading it, and exactly none of the capital she needed. She came to me. Not for money, she was too proud for that, too determined to have done it the real way, the way Bradley's family had always done things, but to ask if I knew anybody who might invest. I called my oldest friend the next morning. Gerald Kim had done my legal work since 1979, back when a handshake and Gerald's father's typewriter were most of what a small business owner needed. I told Gerald what I wanted to do, and I told him how I wanted to do it quietly, through a company, with my name nowhere on the paperwork Vanessa would ever see. Gerald set up a holding company. We called it Riverside Holdings, after the little river that ran behind the first Doyle's Corner. Riverside Holdings bought the building. Riverside Holdings financed the build-out. Riverside Holdings held the note and the lease, and Riverside Holdings, on my instruction, went easy on her for 8 straight years below market rent, late payments quietly absorbed, a slow month in her second year that would have sunk a lot of restaurants forgiven without a single phone call. Vanessa believed, because she'd been told by a lawyer she trusted, that Riverside Holdings was a mystery investor with deep pockets and no interest in meddling. She thanked her lucky stars for that investor more than once, in interviews, at openings, standing under the restaurant sign Cerise, she called it, the French word for the fruit, because she thought it sounded like the place she wanted to become. I never told her it was me. That was the whole point. I didn't want my daughter's gratitude. I wanted my daughter's dream to survive its first hard winter, the way every young restaurant needs somebody standing quietly behind it who isn't going to call the note the moment things get tight. For 8 years, that was enough for me. I watched Cerise become the kind of place people waited 6 weeks for a Saturday table. I watched my daughter's face on the cover of a regional food magazine. I sat in the back of every one of her openings, in my good gray coat, proud in a way that didn't need announcing. And then, slowly, the way water finds the smallest crack in a foundation, I started to notice that pride wasn't a two-way street anymore. The first crack came 3 years ago when Cerise turned 10 and the same food magazine, Plate and Province, came to shoot a feature on Vanessa for the anniversary. I drove 2 hours to be there because Vanessa had mentioned they wanted some family flavor in the shoot. I stood in the lobby in my coat with a bouquet of grocery store carnations, feeling a little foolish and a little hopeful, the way you do at 71 when you still want your daughter to be glad to see you. A young assistant with a clipboard stopped me at the velvet rope around the dining room. Sorry, Sir Family, only for this part of the shoot. I told her I was her father. She checked her clipboard, apologized again, said the family portion was just Bradley and the kids, and Mrs. Marsh, meaning Diane, and that I could wait in the bar area. I waited in the bar area. I watched through the glass as the photographer arranged Vanessa, Bradley, the 2 children, and Diane around a table with candlelight and wine that cost more than my first car. 40 minutes became 90. Nobody came to get me. I drove home with the carnations still in the passenger seat and didn't say a word about it to Vanessa. A misunderstanding, an assistant with a clipboard. I told myself that for a long time. The second crack came the following Christmas. Vanessa called the day before to say the holiday dinner that year was going to be small, just immediate family. Dad, you understand. I said, of course I understood. What I understood less well was the photograph on the restaurant's social media 3 days later, 22 people around 2 pushed together tables. Diane at the head in a red dress, Bradley's brothers and their families, a niece I'd never met holding sparkling cider. Immediate family apparently had a head count of 22, as long as none of those 22 had ever worked a grill. The third crack, and this one still catches in my throat a little to tell you, came at my granddaughter Ava's school recital that spring. She was 11, playing a clarinet solo she'd practiced in my kitchen a dozen Sunday afternoons, sitting on the same kind of step stool her mother once stood on to learn pie crust. The program the school printed listed grandparents in attendance on the back page, a nice little touch the music teacher did every year. My name wasn't on it. I asked Ava about it afterward, gently, not wanting to put anything on an 11-year-old's shoulders that wasn't hers to carry, and she said, in the plain, devastating way children sometimes tell you the truth without meaning to wound you. Mom told the school you weren't really involved, Grandpa. I told her that wasn't true. She said it was just easier. Easier. I have turned that word over more times than I can count since. Easier for who? Somewhere between the second crack and the third, I understood where a good deal of this was actually coming from, and it wasn't entirely my daughter's doing. I was at Bradley's parents' house for a spring gathering, early on, before I'd learned to keep my visits brief, and I overheard Diane in the kitchen telling one of her sisters, in the particular voice people use when they think a closed door makes them invisible, that she'd warned Bradley about marrying into people who still think a booth is fine dining. She wasn't cruel to my face. Ever Diane's the kind of woman who'd never raise her voice at you directly. She did something worse, in a slower and more patient way. Every gathering, she'd ask Vanessa some small, glancing question about her background in front of new people. Remind me, Vanessa, was it a diner or a drive-in your family had? Delivered with a smile, landing exactly where it was aimed. I watched my daughter get smaller in that woman's company, year after year, learning which parts of her story bought her comfort in that world and which parts cost her standing in it. I don't say this to excuse what Vanessa did at that dinner. She's a grown woman who made her own choice with her own mouth, but I'd be lying if I told you Diane hadn't spent a decade quietly teaching her which choice to make. The fourth crack was the one that finally cracked something in me, and it happened 3 months before that anniversary dinner, at a smaller family gathering at Bradley's parents' lake house. My grandson Tyler, 16 by then and starting to notice things the way 16-year-olds do, called me Grandpa in front of some of Bradley's business associates who'd come up for the weekend. Bradley pulled him aside. I watched this happen. I wasn't meant to see it, but the porch windows were open and told him, "Let's just call him Mr. Doyle this weekend, bud. Keeps things simple with the Hendersons here." Tyler looked confused. Did it anyway, because 16-year-olds mostly do what they're told, even when it doesn't sit right with them. I heard him say Mr. Doyle to me not 20 minutes later, stiff as a board, apologizing with his eyes because he didn't have the words yet to apologize with his mouth. I want to tell you something about myself here, because it matters for what comes later. I am not by nature a man who explodes. Margaret used to say I had a slow fuse and a long memory, and she meant it as a compliment. Mostly, I didn't come home from that lake house and call a lawyer in a rage. I came home and I sat at my kitchen counter and I looked at that powder blue tin sitting where it always sits. And I thought about my wife teaching a little girl to wait for dough to tell her it was ready, and I thought, not yet. Not yet. Let it show you the whole shape of itself first. I didn't have to wait long. The whole shape of it showed up 3 months later at Sarah's on the night of the restaurant's 10th year anniversary dinner, the one I told you about at the start of this story. Let me walk you through that night properly, because the version I gave you at the beginning left out most of the room. 26 people. Bradley's parents, Diane and her husband Richard, at the head of the table like visiting royalty. Bradley's 2 brothers and their families. A handful of investors from Meridian Trust. The bank Vanessa was courting for financing on a second location, Cerise Riverside, she wanted to call it, without any idea how close that name sat to the truth. And Simone Reyes, a food critic whose review everyone at that table understood could make or break the second location before it ever opened. The dinner itself was beautiful. I'll give my daughter that without hesitation she is, whatever else is true, a genuinely gifted cook, and the tasting menu that night moved through 6 courses that made the whole table go quiet with pleasure more than once. There was a short rib dish, deep and slow braised, with a crust on the potato beneath it that made Simone Reyes actually close her eyes for a second before she wrote anything in her little notebook. I recognized that crust. I'd tasted it 1,000 times at a counter with 4 stools made by a woman named Margaret Doyle. Vanessa had never told anyone where that dish came from. I don't think by then she entirely let herself remember. Somewhere around the 3rd course, Diane stood up with her wine glass to make a toast, and I want to tell you about that toast specifically because it stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that night. She talked for nearly 3 minutes about family legacy, about how proud she was to watch this family build something that would last for generations, about the importance of family loyalty in a world that didn't respect it enough anymore. She used the word family 11 times. I counted the way you count things when you need somewhere else to put your attention. She never once said Margaret's name. She never once said mine. She raised her glass to a legacy that was, in every practical sense, built on a dead woman's recipes and a living man's quiet money, and she toasted it as though it had sprung up whole from her son's good taste in wives. I smiled and raised my glass with everyone else. That's the part nobody tells you about dignity. Sometimes it looks exactly like clapping politely for the erasure of everything you built. It was over the 5th course, with the wine flowing easy and everyone loosened up, that Diane leaned across the table and asked, not unkindly, the way people ask things when they've had 2 glasses of good Burgundy and no sense of the room, "Vanessa, darling, who's the sweet older gentleman down at the end? Is that your father?" And here is the moment. Here is the moment this whole story turns on, the one I want you to really sit with, because it's the one that decided everything that came after. Vanessa laughed a light laugh, practiced, the kind you use to smooth over a question you didn't want asked, and she said, Oh, him? He's an old friend of the family. Used to run a diner, if you can believe it. Isn't that charming? Simone Reyes looked down the table at me and smiled the polite smile you give someone else's charming old family friend. 26 people, and not one of them corrected her. Not Bradley. Not my grandchildren, who I watched go very still and very quiet in their seats, old enough by then to know exactly what had just happened and too young to know what to do about it. I sat with that for the rest of the dinner. I ate my short rib. I complimented the wine when Richard asked what I thought of it. I was, from the outside, a perfectly pleasant old man having a perfectly pleasant evening. Inside, I was doing something else entirely. I was doing arithmetic, because here is a thing about being the quiet backer of a business for 8 years, you know things. You know the lease on that building was up for renewal in 60 days. You know Meridian Trust wasn't going to approve a second location without a long-term lease commitment on the first, signed and airtight, sitting in their file. You know that somewhere in the loan application my daughter's team had already started drafting, there was a line asking her to disclose any related party financing, gifts, or existing liens on the original property, a standard question every bank asks. Because banks have been burned before by borrowers who forgot to mention who else had a hand in the walls. And I knew that my daughter, who genuinely did not know Riverside Holdings was her father, was about to answer that question with a clean conscience and an incomplete truth. I did not feel triumphant, sitting with that. I felt something closer to grief for a version of that evening where Diane's question had been answered with my name, spoken plainly, no charm required. But grief doesn't pay the bill either way, and dignity, I have found, mostly looks like doing the arithmetic quietly and then going home to sleep on it. Which is exactly what I did. I went home. I put my coat on the hook by the door. I looked at Margaret's tin sitting on the counter, and I said, out loud, to an empty kitchen, "Well, Maggie, I think it's time." The next morning, I called Gerald Kim. Gerald had been managing Riverside Holdings paperwork quietly for 8 years, filing the returns, handling the small stuff. Never once asking me why a retired diner owner wanted to keep such a low profile about owning his own daughter's building. When I told him what had happened at the dinner, he was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then he said the thing I needed a friend to say instead of a lawyer. "Al, you don't have to do anything with this. You could let it go. Some men would." "I know," I said. "But the lease renewal's in 60 days, and the bank's going to ask her a question she doesn't know the real answer to. I'm not going to let my daughter walk into a loan committee and accidentally misrepresent something to a bank because I was too proud to tell her the truth 8 years ago. That's not revenge, Hal. That's just paperwork. I know that too," I said. "But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't going to enjoy watching her find out. Here's what I want you to understand about the plan Gerald and I built over the next several weeks, because I know some of you listening have wondered at some point in a story like this whether the quiet, dignified route is really just revenge wearing a nicer coat. I'll let you be the judge. What we did was this. Nothing dramatic. Nothing illegal. Nothing that a single honest lawyer anywhere in this country would call anything but standard business practice. We simply stopped pretending Riverside Holdings was a charity. Gerald drafted a standard lease renewal letter, the kind landlords send tenants every single day in this country, ending the below-market rent that had quietly applied for 8 years and returning it to fair market value. We prepared, alongside it, full documentation of the original 2018 financing, the promissory note, the personal guarantee Vanessa had signed without ever meeting the lender, the operating agreement for Riverside Holdings with my name listed plainly as managing member. And Gerald reached out in his capacity as the landlord's counsel to request a seat at the upcoming lease renewal meeting Meridian Trust had scheduled as part of their due diligence on the expansion loan, a meeting Vanessa and Bradley were already required to attend. Because no bank approves an expansion loan without sitting down with the landlord of the existing property first. That's not a trick. That's just how commercial lending works. Ask anyone who's ever tried to open a second restaurant. Gerald called me back 2 weeks into the preparation, and I could hear something careful in his voice. The tone of a man who's found something he isn't sure he's supposed to have found. Al, before we go any further with this, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight. Do you want to hurt her, or do you want to protect her? I sat with that question longer than I sat with most things that year. I want her to see the truth clearly enough that she can't edit it anymore, I finally said. What she does after that is hers to decide. I'm not in the business of hurting my own daughter, Gerald. I'm in the business of finally being honest with her. 8 years late. All right, he said. Then there's something else you should know before the meeting, and I want you sitting down for this one. There was one more piece, and this one Gerald found almost by accident, doing the kind of routine background work any competent attorney does before a meeting like that. Bradley had, over the past 2 years, taken over procurement for Cerise's Supply Contracts wine, produce, linens, the works as his contribution to his wife's business. Gerald's review of the vendor invoices, standard practice for a landlord verifying a tenant's financial health before a lease renewal, turned up a pattern any restaurant accountant would recognize immediately. 3 vendors billing at rates 12 to 18% above market. All 3 routed through a single new distribution company that happened to share a mailing address with a storage unit Bradley rented under his own name. It's an old trick in this industry. Older than Doyle's Corner, a manager quietly inserts a shell distributor between the restaurant and its real suppliers and pockets the markup. It's documented in restaurant fraud cases going back decades, and it's exactly the kind of thing a landlord's financial review, done properly, is designed to catch. I didn't go looking for that. I want to be clear about that. I went looking for a lease renewal. What I found was a second story sitting quietly inside the first one, waiting for somebody to finally open the right drawer. Before I tell you what happened in that meeting, I want to tell you about something that happened the week before it, because it matters more to me than almost anything else in this story, and because I think it's the part that turned everything I was doing from a plan into something I could live with afterward. I had dinner with my granddaughter Ava on a Tuesday, just the 2 of us, something we'd done every couple of weeks since she was small. She was 12 now, sharper every time I saw her, and that night she asked me out of nowhere, the way children ask the questions adults have been avoiding, why her mother had a photo in her office of Grandma's old blue tin but never talked about where the recipes came from. And sitting there across from her, it really hit me, all at once, in a way it hadn't quite managed to in all the months since that dinner, what I had actually been watching happen for 8 years. It wasn't just that my daughter had been ashamed to say my name out loud at a party. It was that somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself she'd built Cerise entirely alone, out of nothing but her own hands, because admitting her mother's crust recipe was sitting under a stranger's 5-star review. Admitting a diner man's quiet money was holding up the walls would have meant admitting she still needed the family she'd spent a decade learning to explain away. She hadn't erased me out of cruelty. She'd erased me because keeping me visible would have meant keeping the whole truth visible, and the whole truth didn't fit the story she needed Diane's world to believe about her. That was the moment I stopped wanting to win anything. I just wanted her to see it, all of it. Clearly, once, with nowhere left to look away. The meeting happened on a Thursday morning in a glass-walled conference room at Meridian Trust. Vanessa and Bradley sat on one side of the table with their loan officer and a stack of paperwork 3 inches thick. Gerald and I sat on the other with a stack considerably thinner, because the truth, it turns out, doesn't need as much paper as the story you tell instead of it. Vanessa looked at me when I walked in, confused in the particular way you're confused when someone shows up somewhere they have no obvious business being. Dad? What are you? Gerald spoke before I did, calm and even, the way he's spoken in rooms like this for 40 years. Mrs. Marsh, I'm here representing Riverside Holdings, the landlord and original financing source for the Cerise property. Your father is the managing member. I watched it land on her face in stages. First disbelief and actual laugh, short and confused, like she thought it was a strange joke. Then she looked at the operating agreement Gerald slid across the table, my name printed plainly under managing member, dated 8 years earlier, the same month she'd told me an anonymous investor had come through for her out of nowhere. Then she looked at me, and I watched a decade of a story she'd told herself and everyone else start to come apart in real time, right there under the fluorescent lights. Priya Anand, the loan officer running the meeting, looked between the three of us, clearly sensing she'd walked into something that predated her paperwork by a decade, and said, gently, "Would you like a few minutes, or would you prefer we continue?" "Continue," Vanessa said, before I could answer, and I felt something in my chest loosen a little at that. Whatever else was coming, my daughter wasn't going to run from the room. "You," she said to me, ignoring everyone else at the table for a moment. "Just that. It was you, the whole time." "It was me," I said. 8 years. Her voice climbed, and I watched her hands go flat on the table like she needed something solid under them. 8 years, Dad. Every dollar of this place, every night, I told a room full of people I built this alone. You let me stand up there and say that. You let Simone Reyes write it in a magazine. You let me believe it in my own head, where it mattered most. Do you have any idea what that's like? To find out the floor you thought you built with your own 2 hands was actually something somebody handed you and never told you about? "I have some idea," I said quietly. "I've had 8 years to think about exactly what that would feel like the day you found out. I decided it was worth it anyway. That wasn't your decision to make for me." "No," I said, "it wasn't. And I've made my peace with being wrong about that part, if that's what this turns out to be. But I'd ask you to sit with one more thing before you decide how angry to be. I didn't do it so you'd owe me anything. I did it so you wouldn't have to know. At 29 years old, with a brand new restaurant and a marriage into a family that made you feel small, that your own father was the only thing standing between you and losing it all. I made a choice to carry that instead of you. You're welcome to be furious that I never told you. I just ask you not to mistake it for something crueler than it was." She was quiet for a long moment, breathing hard, and I watched her do what I have watched her do since she was small enough to stand on a step stool, work something difficult all the way through instead of setting it down half finished. "I wanted you to believe you'd done it on your own," I said, softer now, "because in every way that matters, you did. I just made sure you had a floor under you the first few years in case you fell." It was Bradley who broke the silence after that, reaching for the anger that comes easiest to a man caught somewhere he doesn't want to be. "This is absurd. Why would you hide this? What kind of father does that? The kind who watched his daughter get told by your mother's world that a diner man wasn't good enough to sit at the family table," I said. And I said it without raising my voice, because I had waited a long time to say it, and I wasn't going to waste it on volume. I hid it because I didn't need credit. I need you both, though, to understand something plainer than that. And this part's for the bank as much as for you. The renewal terms on this lease are changing. Market rate, starting next quarter. No more forgiven shortfalls. That's not punishment. Any landlord in this city would tell you 8 years of below-market rent was never something you were entitled to. It was something I chose to give a daughter I loved, quietly, because I didn't think she needed to know I loved her that much to still say yes. Priya Anand cleared her throat. "Mr. Doyle, given this disclosure, I do want to note the application currently on file lists no related party financing on the original build-out. That's a required field. We'll need an amended application before this can move forward." "I understand," Vanessa said quietly, "and I want you to know, whatever else she'd done, she didn't try to argue that point for even a second. Some things about my daughter never needed fixing. I didn't know there was anything to disclose. I'll fix it today." It was Gerald, gently, who moved us to the second piece. the one nobody at that table but Bradley had seen coming. There's one more matter the landlord's financial review turned up, and I think it's better discussed here than left for the bank to find independently. He laid out the vendor invoices, the markup, the shell company, the storage unit. Bradley's face went through its own stages, then first a scramble at explanation, something about consolidating suppliers for efficiency, and then, when Priya Anand asked to see the distribution company's registration paperwork and Bradley couldn't produce it, something closer to silence. Vanessa didn't yell at him. That's not who she is, whatever her flaws. She just looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at someone when you're doing your own arithmetic for the first time, and she said, "How long? Vanessa, how long?" "Bradley, 2 years," he said, and that was the last thing he said in that meeting that I remember clearly. I drove home from that meeting with the windows down, even though it was cold enough that I probably shouldn't have, because I needed the air moving against my face to feel like something other than the inside of my own chest. The plot was over. Meridian Trust would get its amended paperwork. Bradley would lose his role. The lease would renew at market rate. All of that had been decided in about 40 minutes, with lawyers in the room and Priya Anand taking careful notes. But driving those 2 hours home, I understood that none of that had actually touched the thing that had been sitting in me since the night of that toast, and it wasn't until 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, that the rest of it finally came due. On that Sunday afternoon, Vanessa showed up at my door alone, without calling first, holding nothing but her car keys and a look on her face I hadn't seen since she was 9 years old and had broken Margaret's favorite serving bowl and didn't know how to say she was sorry. She sat at my kitchen counter. She looked at the powder blue tin sitting where it always sits, and she said, "The short rib crust." Everyone thinks I invented it. "I know," I said. "It's Mom's, isn't it? The potato thing under it." "It's your mother's crust, made her mother's way," I said. "You've been serving your grandmother's cooking to food critics for a decade and telling yourself you built it from nothing." She started crying then, the real kind, the kind that isn't pretty and doesn't care who's watching, and she said the thing I'd been waiting 8 years and one very expensive dinner to hear. I was so afraid that if people knew where I came from, they'd decide I didn't belong where I'd gotten to. So I edited you out. Both of you. I told myself it was easier. "I know," I said again, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for somebody is let them say the hard sentence all the way to the end without rescuing them from the middle of it. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today," she said. "I don't think I've earned that yet." "No," I said. "You haven't. But you're sitting in my kitchen instead of hiding from it, and that's further than you've come in 8 years. We'll get to the rest." She looked around my kitchen for a long moment then, the way you look at a room you grew up in and stopped seeing properly a long time ago, the same table, the same chipped tile by the sink Margaret always meant to replace and never did, the same window over the sink where the morning light used to catch the flour dust in the air while she did her homework on a flour sack. "I forgot what this kitchen smelled like," she said quietly. "I used to be able to close my eyes anywhere in the world and know exactly what this kitchen smelled like. I don't know when I stopped remembering that." "You didn't stop remembering," I said. "You just stopped letting yourself admit you still did." I gave her the tin that afternoon. Not all of it, some of those recipes are mine to keep a while longer, but the crust card, in her mother's handwriting, with a note I wrote on the back before I handed it over for the menu, if you ever want to put her name where it belongs. In the months that followed, the consequences sorted themselves out the way consequences generally do, which is to say slowly, and mostly without anyone needing to raise their voice again. Bradley didn't go quietly, not at first. He argued for a couple of weeks that the markup was industry standard, that Vanessa was overreacting to a business decision she didn't understand. It was Priya Anand who ended that argument for good. Meridian Trust's compliance review required a full vendor audit, and once the bank's auditors confirmed the same pattern Gerald had found, it stopped being a family disagreement and became a documented finding and a federal loan file. Bradley was removed from any operational role at Saritz within the month. Vanessa's decision. The insurer's investigation and the civil claim that followed recovered a good portion of what he'd skimmed, though not without a fair amount of unpleasantness in the divorce that followed a year later, and not without Bradley losing the one thing his mother's approval had always been conditioned on, being seen as the responsible one. Diane's reckoning came 5 months later at a family dinner at Vanessa's house, and I was there for this one, sitting close enough to see it happen. Diane had just started another toast she always did at every gathering, the way some people say grace out of habit rather than conviction going on about families that know where they truly come from. Vanessa set her wine glass down before Diane had finished, not sharply, but with enough quiet weight that the table noticed. Since we're talking about where people truly come from, Vanessa said, gently, in the same voice her mother used to use when she wanted a hard truth to land soft, I had Gerald's office pull some background paperwork a few months back for the loan, standard due diligence on everyone connected to the financing. It turned up a bankruptcy filing from 30 years ago. Richard's father's construction company, 1994, I only mention it because I spent a decade thinking my family's diners made me the one who didn't quite belong at this table. Diane went very still, her fork resting halfway to her mouth. That's ancient history. It has nothing to do with no, Vanessa agreed. It doesn't. That's sort of my point. She picked her wine glass back up. Everybody's from some kind of nothing if you look far enough back, Diane. I just didn't used to know that applied to your family, too. Diane didn't finish her toast that evening. She set her glass down, folded her napkin with more care than the moment required, and didn't say much for the rest of the meal. She still comes to family dinners, I'll give her that she didn't run from the room any more than Vanessa had. But she stopped asking Vanessa which restaurant her family used to run. These days, when I'm at the table, she asks me questions about the diners instead, careful ones. The way you ask questions of someone you've only recently decided is worth being curious about. Saritz Riverside opened 14 months later, on schedule, financing approved, the amended paperwork clean as a bell. There's a dish on the menu now called Margaret's Crust, and the card on the table that describes it tells the truth of four-stool diner on a highway corner. A woman who taught her daughter that the secret was never the recipe, it was patience. Simone Reyes reviewed the new location. She mentioned that dish by name and called it the soul of the restaurant. She still doesn't know I was the sweet older gentleman at the far end of that long table 3 years earlier. I've never minded not being known. I've only ever minded being denied. My grandchildren call me Grandpa again, plainly, in every room, in front of anyone who cares to hear it. Ava keeps a tin of her own, now a green one, a birthday gift from me, with the start of her own set of cards inside, in handwriting that's still finding its shape. Tyler apologized to me on his own, unprompted, the way 16-year-olds do when they've finally caught up to what they saw on that porch. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. He'd been asked to carry something too heavy for a kid his age, and he'd set it down the first honest chance he got. As for that dinner, the one that started all of it, I think about it less than you'd expect. What I remember most isn't the sting of what my daughter said. It's the quiet certainty I felt, standing up from that table, that I didn't need to shout or beg or announce who I was to 26 strangers to know exactly what I was worth. Dignity, I've learned late in a long life, was never about being recognized in the room. It's about knowing, whether they see you or not, precisely which table is actually yours. If you'd been sitting where I was sitting that night, with that folder in front of you and a whole quiet card in your pocket, would you have played it that night in front of everyone? Or would you have waited the way I did and let the truth find its own table in its own time? I'd love to know what you'd have done. Tell me in the comments, and tell me your age too. I've noticed the ones of us who've lived the longest usually give the wisest answers. Before you go, I'll tell you this much about where we're headed next. There's a man out west of here named Walt, who spent 60 years working a piece of farmland his grandfather cleared by hand, and one afternoon, his own son showed him a deed that said none of it had ever really been his to give away. What Walt found buried in that farmhouse, in a coffee can nobody had opened since 1962, is going to change how you think about every family that's ever fought over a piece of land. I'll see you there.